Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest leveling build for the Spiritborn in Season 6. With this build you can easily level from level 1 to 60 without needing any specific gear. I have tested all the abilities while leveling, and this is a really easy and fun build to play, and I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 26 pit, and I don't even have good gear. Since you will be leveling, you will be always switching out your gear for better gear until you reach level 60. So when leveling, it's best to just equip the higher item power level gear, and once you're at level 60, then you would want to target farm your gear for a specific build you like. And with this build there are many skills that complement each other, offering a lot of powerful combinations, but I'll cover everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the skills. Now the basic skill I'm using is Thunder Spike, and with this skill you'll quickly jab forward with a piercing strike, damaging enemies while gaining some vigor. Your third attack will pierce farther and reduce your evade's cooldown. Your third strike will also pull and knock down enemies. Now we're going to use this basic skill a lot to regain vigor, and this skill is really good for crowd control and to quickly stagger bosses. The next skill I'm using is the core skill, Quill Volley, and this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will hurl out feathers, doing tons of damage to enemies and making them vulnerable. The next skill I'm using is Scourge, and this skill will call forth a centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies for every enemy this skill crowd controls, and you have a chance to lifesteal enemies affected by Scourge. Now this skill is really good for survivability because this skill will fear enemies around you and gain you some lifesteal. The next skill I'm using is Ravager, and this skill has a passive ability that grants you ferocity, and what ferocity does is it will increase your attack speed, and when this skill is active, your attacks will do more damage and dash you to enemies when you use your core skill and increase your vigor regeneration. Now the main reason we are taking this skill is to gain the vigor regeneration because we want to use the core skill Quill Volley as much as possible. And the next skill I'm using is the ultimate skill, the Hunter, and this skill will leap you to an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset this skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. Now because of another skill, Intricacy, on the skill tree, this skill will allow you to cast a previous skill up to 3 times after you use your ultimate skill. So it's best to either use Scourge or Soar before using the ultimate skill. You want to cast Scourge if you want to easily gain stacks, which will greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies and gain tons of crowd control, or cast Soar if you want to quickly move around the map to speed farm dungeons. And the last skill I'm using is a mobility skill, Soar, and this skill will basically teleport you to an area and make you unstoppable. This skill is really good for speed farming dungeons if you use the ultimate skill after this skill, so you get 3 free casts, but I mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects. Okay, so next for the Spirit Hall. Now the primary spirit I'm using is the Eagle Spirit, and this states casting an Eagle skill grants 4 seconds of the Storm Feathers movement speed bonus. When you evade, dealing up to 8 Storm Feathers for every remaining second, each dealing 2,947 lightning damage and making targets vulnerable for 5 seconds. All skills are now also Eagle skills. Now I took the Eagle Spirit to gain the additional movement speed so I can speed farm to quickly gain levels. And the second spirit I took is the Jaguar Spirit, and this states maximum ferocity increased by 1. Gain 1 stack of ferocity when you kill an enemy or damage a boss. Now gaining ferocity is really strong because ferocity will greatly increase your attack speed. Okay, so next for the Mercenaries. Now for the hired Mercenaries, I chose Rahir to gain tons of survivability, and this is what I chose for the skill path. So first, Valiance will have your Mercenary knock down enemies and grant you unstoppable if you're damaged at least 15% of your current life. Then I chose the skill Shield Charge, which will taunt enemies and fortify you. And then I chose Rahir's Guard, which will grant you 15% armor. And the next skill I chose is Provoke, which will taunt enemies and grant you damage reduction. And then I chose Iron Wolf's Ward, which will make the Mercenary knock down close enemies and taunt distant enemies. And this skill will also reduce the cooldown for the Valiant skill. And for the reinforcement, I chose the Mercenary Variana, and the skill I chose is Bloodthirst. And I mainly chose this skill to gain 10% attack speed when this skill is active, and I paired it with Quill Volley because I'll use Quill Volley all the time, and I want Bloodthirst to be active whenever it's off cooldown. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now this is a leveling build. So with this skill tree, you don't need any specific gear for this build to work. This build is strong for quickly leveling to level 60. So starting with the basic skills, I put 5 points into Thunder Spike, a point into Enhanced Thunder Spike, and a point into Sharp Thunder Spike. And with this skill, you will quickly jab forward with a piercing strike, damaging enemies while gaining you some vigor. Your third strike will also pull and knock down enemies. Now we are going to use this basic skill a lot to regain vigor, and this skill is really good for crowd control and to quickly stagger bosses. Next for the core skills, I put 5 points into Quill Volley, a point into Enhanced Quill Volley, and a point into Advantage Quill Volley. And this is our main damage dealing skill. This skill will hurl out feathers, doing tons of damage to enemies and making them vulnerable. Next I put 3 points into Follow Through, and this skill will greatly increase your basic skills damage. And since this is a leveling build, you'll be using your basic skill a lot. Next I put 3 points into Vigorous, and this skill will increase your vigor regeneration when you use your core skill. And next I put 3 points into Balance Exertion, and this skill will increase your core skills damage, but in return your core skill will cost more vigor. Now ideally you want to put your last 3 skill points into this skill, because in the early levels you won't have a lot of vigor, and it's better to cast more of your core skill, Quill Volley, instead to increase its damage. Next for the focus skills, I put 1 point into Soar, a point into Enhanced Soar, and a point into Measured Soar. And this skill will basically teleport you to a target area and make you unstoppable. This skill is really good for speed farming dungeons if you use the ultimate skill after this skill, so you get 3 free casts, but I mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects. Next I put 1 point into Ravager, a point into Enhanced Ravager, and a point into Measured Ravager. And this skill has a passive ability that grants you Ferocity, and Ferocity will increase your attack speed. And when this skill is active, your attacks will do more damage and dash you to enemies when you use your core skill and increase your vigor regeneration. Now the main reason we are taking this skill is to gain the vigor regeneration, because we want to use the core skill Quill Volley as much as possible. Next I put 1 point into Focal Point and 3 points into Apex, and this skill will greatly increase your vulnerable damage. And then I put 3 points into Diminishment, and with this skill vulnerable enemies will do less damage to you, and with this build you can easily apply vulnerable to enemies. Next for the defensive skills, I put 5 points into Scourge, a point into Enhanced Scourge, and a point into Adaptable Scourge. And this skill will call forth a centipede, poisoning enemies and slowing and fearing enemies around. This skill will also greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies for every enemy this skill crowd controls, and you have a chance to lifesteal enemies affected by Scourge. Now this skill is really good for survivability, because this skill will fear enemies around you and gain you some lifesteal. Next for the potency skills, I put 3 points into Brilliance, and this skill will greatly increase your Eagle skill damage based on your movement speed bonus. And then I put 3 points into Acceleration, and with this skill you will gain 3 additional evade charges, and after you evade, your next Eagle skill will deal increased damage. Next for the ultimate skills, I put 5 points into the Hunter, a point into Harmonious Hunter, and a point into Exalted Hunter. And this skill will leap you to an area doing AoE damage to enemies. This skill will also greatly increase your ferocity, and while this skill is active, you have a chance to reset this skill's cooldown when you kill an enemy. Next I put 3 points into Resolution, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to elites after casting an ultimate skill. And next I put 3 points into Spiritual Attunement, and this skill will increase your maximum vigor if you have an ultimate skill equipped. And next I put 3 points into Supremacy, and this skill will greatly increase your damage when using your ultimate skill. And next I put 1 point into Sustenance, which will heal you when you use your ultimate skill, and 1 point into Initiative, which will grant you Unstoppable when casting your ultimate skill. And this skill is useful to break out of crowd control effects with your ultimate skill if your mobility skill Soar is on cooldown. And then I put 3 points into Intricacy, and this skill will allow you to cast a previous skill up to 3 times after you use your ultimate skill, and it's best to either use Scourge or Soar before using the ultimate skill. You want to cast Scourge if you want to easily gain stacks, which will greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies and gain tons of crowd control, or cast Soar if you want to quickly move around the map to speed farm dungeons. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put a point into Prodigy's Tempo, and this states every third consecutive cast of the same basic skill increases all purchase skill ranks by 2 for 5 seconds. Every third cast of the same core skill or potency skill reduces all skills active cooldown by 10%, increased by 2% for each of their skill ranks. So you want to cast your basic skill 3 or more times in a row, and also your core skill 3 or more times in a row to gain the effect of this key passive, which is really strong. Okay, so that's a full skill tree layout for this leveling build to speed level to level 60 very easily. And with this build, you don't need any specific gear for this build to work. And I'll have the full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now, since this is a leveling build, you don't need any specific gear for this build to work. Now, ideally, you just want to equip the gear with a higher item power level to get the higher stats. But one stat I do look for when leveling is movement speed, because having high movement speed, you can speed around the map and speed farm dungeons, which will gain you levels very quickly. Now, there is one legendary aspect you can use to greatly increase your damage, and it's the rebounding aspect, which will make your quill volley feathers explode at their apex and return to where they were cast. And you can easily get this legendary aspect by completing a dungeon called the Forge of Malice, located near a waypoint in Nahantu, as you can see on this map. But in the early leveling process, you don't really need this legendary aspect. And in the D4 build planner, I will have the ideal stats and legendary aspect you're looking for this leveling build, but it is not required, because when leveling, you will be always upgrading your gear for better gear. But once you're ready to get to the torment level difficulties, that's when you want to focus on a specific build to greatly increase your damage and survivability. And I'll have updated endgame builds down the road, so stay tuned. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board. Now, since this is a leveling build and I just started using the Paragon Board, I'm just going to showcase what I'm using right now and the first legendary node you're looking to use for this leveling build. So starting with the star board, I'm using the Headhunter glyph, and the additional bonus states you deal 10% increased damage to elites. And the next Paragon Board I'm using is Revealing to take the legendary node, which states lucky hit, up to a 30% chance to knock down vulnerable enemies. You deal 30% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. Now, we're mainly taking this legendary node for the second part because we can easily crowd control enemies with this build, and you will deal 30% increased damage to them. Okay, so that's the Paragon Board layout I have as of right now, and this is ideally the best legendary node to take for this leveling build until you get specific gear for a different build. But once I get specific gear for certain builds, I will have endgame builds fully completed, so stay tuned. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest leveling build for the Spiritborn in Season 6. This build is so strong that you can easily level from 1 to 60 without needing any specific gear. This build is really fun and easy to play, and I highly recommend you to test it out. And I'll have this full leveling build layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Hope this helps, and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,